April 1944, Central Louisiana. 9 black soldiers in United States Army uniforms stand in a train station kitchen, watching through a doorway as their country's sworn enemies sit down for lunch. The German prisoners of war laugh, smoke, order second Simmons. The Americans cannot even buy coffee. One of those soldiers, a 44-year-old corporal from Trinidad named Rupert Trimmingham, makes a decision in that moment that will help reshape the entire American military. He's going to write it all down. He's going to send it to the Army's own magazine. And he's betting everything that they'll actually print it. Corporal Rupert Stanley Trimmingham wasn't supposed to be in Louisiana at all. By April 1944, he'd spent most of his adult life far from the Jim Crow South. Born in Port of Spain, Trinidad on August 17, 1899, he'd sailed as a merchant seaman from Wales to England before immigrating to the United States in 1925. He'd settled in Newark, New Jersey, married, worked as an electrician. When he enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers in 1942 at age 43, he knew he'd face discrimination. Every black man who put on the uniform knew that. But Trinidad-born, Europe-traveled Rupert Trimmingham had never experienced the particular brutality of the Deep South, not until the Army sent him to Camp Claiborne. Camp Claiborne sat in the pine forests of Rapides Parish, Louisiana, about 18 miles southwest of Alexandria. Built in 1940 on 23,000 acres of Kisatchie National Forest, it had become one of the largest training installations in the country. Over 500,000 men passed through Camp Claiborne during the war. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were created there. The famous 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, trained there before joining Patton's Third Army. It was also, by 1944, home to thousands of German prisoners of war. The Germans arrived at Camp Claiborne in November 1943, captured from the North African and Italian campaigns. By the time Trimmingham was stationed there, approximately 3,000 German POWs lived in a separate compound on the base. The Geneva Convention required that they be treated humanely, fed adequately, housed properly. The prisoners worked in the camp's operations, on surrounding farms, in lumber mills throughout central Louisiana. They were paid 27 cents per hour. They had access to the camp canteen, where they could buy cigarettes and candy. They received German-language newspapers and magazines. Several times a week, they watched movies. They were, by any measure, treated better than the black American soldiers who guarded them. For Trimmingham and his 8 companions, April 1944 meant a medical transfer. They were traveling by train from Camp Claiborne to the Army Hospital at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Fort Huachuca, located in the desert 14 miles north of the Mexican border, was known as the home of the black soldier. Between 1941 and 1945, over 30,000 black infantrymen would train there. The 93rd and 92nd Infantry divisions, both all-black units, prepared for combat at Fort Huachuca. It was the only major installation in the country where black soldiers outnumbered white. For men stationed in the Jim Crow South, transfer to Fort Huachuca felt like escape. But first, they had to get there. The train made a scheduled layover in a small Louisiana town. The sources don't record which town, just a small Louisiana town, somewhere between Camp Claiborne and the western border. The 9 soldiers had an entire day to wait before their connecting train. They were hungry. They wanted coffee. They were American soldiers in American uniforms traveling on official Army orders. In most of the country by 1944, that would have meant something. In Louisiana, it meant nothing. They tried every lunchroom in town, every restaurant, every diner, every cafe. The answer was always the same. We don't serve coloreds. One after another, doors closing, white faces turning away. These were men who'd taken an oath to defend this country, who'd left their families and jobs and lives to serve, and they couldn't buy a cup of coffee in the country they'd sworn to protect. Finally, they found one place that would serve them, the lunchroom at the railroad station. But there were conditions. They couldn't sit at the tables. They couldn't be seen by the other customers. They had to go through the back, into the kitchen. That's where they'd be served. In the kitchen, like help. Like they were the ones who worked there instead of the ones who'd paid for a meal. So they went to the kitchen. What choice did they have? They were hungry, exhausted from traveling, facing another full day before the next train. They ordered their food, they waited, and then, at 11:30 in the morning, they watched through the kitchen doorway as approximately 24 German prisoners of war entered the restaurant. The POWs were accompanied by 2 American guards, white guards. The Germans filed into the dining room, sat down at the tables, the same tables that Trimmingham and his men had been forbidden to use. Waitresses came over, smiling, taking orders. The POWs talked among themselves in German, laughed at jokes the guards couldn't understand. Someone pulled out cigarettes. The guards didn't object. Someone asked for more coffee. It was poured immediately. The prisoners and their guards settled in for a leisurely meal, chatting, relaxing, in no particular hurry. And in the kitchen, 9 American soldiers watched. Trimmingham stood there, looking out at men who'd been shooting at American soldiers just months earlier, men who'd been captured while fighting for Hitler, men whose government had started a war that killed millions, men who belonged to an ideology that preached racial superiority, that murdered millions based on their religion and ethnicity. These men, these Nazi soldiers, sat at tables in an American restaurant, served by American waitresses, guarded by American soldiers who treated them like friends. While 9 black American soldiers ate in the kitchen, something broke in that moment, or maybe something clarified. Trimmingham had seen discrimination before. Every black man in America had. But this was different. This wasn't just about separate water fountains or the back of the bus. This was about the fundamental question that every black soldier was asking himself in 1944. What exactly are we fighting for? Black men were dying in Italy at that exact moment. The 92nd Infantry Division was fighting its way up the Italian peninsula, taking casualties, earning medals. Black pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron were flying combat missions over Europe. Black sailors were loading ammunition at ports across the Pacific. Black soldiers were preparing for the invasion of France that would come 2 months later. They were fighting, bleeding, dying for America. And America wouldn't let them eat in a restaurant, but it would serve lunch to Nazi prisoners. Trimmingham couldn't stop thinking about it. On the train to Fort Huachuca, in his bunk at the hospital, during the following days and weeks, the image stayed with him. Those German soldiers laughing, those guards relaxed, friendly. That kitchen doorway, like a barrier between 2 different Americas. Or maybe not 2 Americas, maybe just the real America, the one that black soldiers saw clearly, but white America pretended didn't exist. He decided to write about it. He'd heard of Yank magazine, the Army's weekly publication. It was written by soldiers, for soldiers, distributed to American servicemen around the world. Yank was known for printing soldiers' letters, complaints, observations, stories from the field. It had a reputation for being willing to publish things that made the brass uncomfortable. The magazine had printed letters criticizing officers, questioning policies, describing the reality of military life without the propaganda filter. But would they print this? Trimmingham sat down and wrote what he'd seen. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't editorialize beyond asking the obvious questions. He just described what happened at that railroad station, then posed the questions that the experience had forced him to ask. Here is a question that each Negro soldier is asking, he wrote. What is the Negro soldier fighting for? On whose team are we playing? He described the incident simply, matter-of-factly. 9 soldiers traveling on army orders, unable to buy coffee anywhere in town, finally allowed to eat in a kitchen. Then the German POWs arriving with their guards, sitting at tables, being served, enjoying their meal. They entered the lunchroom, sat at the tables, had their meals served, talked, smoked, in fact, had quite a swell time. Then Trimmingham asked the questions that needed asking. I stood on the outside looking on, and I could not help but ask myself these questions. Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are they not taught to hate and destroy all democratic governments? Are we not American soldiers, sworn to fight for and die if need be for this country? Then why are they treated better than we are? Why are we pushed around like cattle? If we are fighting for the same thing, if we are to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on? He ended with a challenge, one that showed he understood exactly what he was doing. Some of the boys are saying that you will not print this letter. I'm saying that you will. He signed it, Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and mailed it to Yank magazine's editorial offices. Then he waited. The letter arrived at Yank's offices in New York. Someone read it. Then someone else read it. Editors discussed it. This wasn't just another complaint about bad food or long marches. This was about the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American war effort. The United States was fighting a war against fascism, against Nazi racial ideology, against Hitler's concept of a master race. American propaganda emphasized democracy, equality, freedom. We were the good guys fighting the bad guys. We were defending civilization against barbarism, and we were treating German POWs better than our own black soldiers. The editors at Yank knew this would cause controversy. They knew it would generate anger from white Southerners, complaints from politicians, possibly repercussions from the brass. They also knew it was absolutely true, because Trimmingham wasn't describing some isolated incident. He was describing a systematic reality that existed across the American South. On April 28, 1944, Yank magazine published Trimmingham's letter under the heading Democracy. They printed every word. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured into Yank's offices, hundreds of them, from soldiers stationed around the world, from sailors in the Pacific, from airmen in England. And here's what shocked the editors. The overwhelming majority supported Trimmingham. They were outraged by what he'd experienced. They demanded to know how this was acceptable. Even more surprising, most of the letters came from white servicemen, and many of those came from Southerners. Private Henry S. Wooten, Jr. wrote from somewhere in the European theater, his letter co-signed by 2 fellow soldiers. Frankly, I think that this incident is a disgrace to a democratic nation such as ours is supposed to be. Are we fighting for such a thing as this? Certainly not. If this is democracy, I don't want any part of it. I wonder what the Aryan supermen think when they get a first-hand glimpse of our racial discrimination. In closing, let me say that a lot of us, especially in the South, should cast the beam out of our own eyes before we try to do so in others overseas. Another soldier wrote, "I'm not a Negro, but I've been around, and I know what the score is. I want to thank Yank and congratulate Corporal Rupert Trimmingham." Letters kept arriving. Within days, it was clear that Trimmingham's letter had touched something fundamental. Soldiers who'd never spoken up about racism before were writing to say they'd witnessed the same thing. They'd seen German POWs treated better than black Americans. They'd watched it happen and said nothing, and now they felt ashamed. Back at Fort Huachuca, Trimmingham was receiving his own mail. Every day brought 3, 4, 5 letters, then more. He went on furlough and returned to find 25 letters waiting. The stack kept growing. By July 28th, when Yank published a follow-up letter from Trimmingham, he'd received 287 personal letters responding to his original one. 183 of those letters came from white men and women in the armed services. Most came from people born and raised in the Deep South. "Allow me to thank you for publishing my letter," Trimmingham wrote in his follow-up. "Although there was some doubt about its being published, yet somehow I felt that Yank was too great a paper not to. Each day brings 3, 4, or 5 letters to me in answer to my letter. I just returned from furlough and found 25 letters awaiting me. To date, I've received 287 letters, and strange as it may seem, 183 are from white men and women in the armed service." Another strange feature about these letters is that most of these people are from the Deep South. These Southern white soldiers told Trimmingham they were proud of their region but ashamed of its racism. They said they recognized that segregation and discrimination were playing Hitler's game. They promised that when they came home, things would change. They acknowledged that thousands of white Americans were willing to fight the racism that too many white people were keeping alive. Yank's editors reported that they'd received a great number of comments from GIs, almost all of whom were outraged by the treatment given the corporal. The magazine noted that Trimmingham's letter had been taken from Yank and widely quoted. Newspapers across the country picked it up. Radio programs dramatized it. On June 14, 1944, the New Yorker magazine published a short story by Robert E. McLaughlin titled a short wait between trains, based directly on Trimmingham's experience. The story would be republished multiple times over the following decades, in 1945, 1949, and 1990. In 1945, radio writer Ruth Moore wrote a one-act play incorporating Trimmingham's account for the Stage for Action, a social activist theater organization in Chicago. The play premiered on October 28, 1945 at Northwestern University and was restaged in Chicago in 1957 as part of the United Nations International Theater Month. But the impact went far beyond literature and theater. Trimmingham's letter became part of the evidence that racism in the military was not just morally wrong, but strategically dangerous. It undermined morale. It gave propaganda ammunition to the enemy. It made America's claims about democracy look like lies. And Trimmingham wasn't describing something unique. His experience at that Louisiana railroad station was part of a much larger pattern. In February 1944, 2 months before Trimmingham's incident, a black soldier named Bert Barbero wrote a letter describing conditions at a POW camp in Texas. The camp had segregated latrines, one section for Negro soldiers, the other for German prisoners and white soldiers. As Barbero wrote, this placed the tyrant over the liberator. At least 2 camps in Mississippi had similar arrangements, where German POWs used the same facilities as white Americans, while black Americans were segregated. In 1997, more than 50 years later, Charles W. Dryden, one of the famous Tuskegee Airmen, published his memoirs. He described visiting a base in South Carolina during the war where German POWs could enter the white side of the post-exchange cafeteria. And we could not, Dryden wrote, the capital letters still carrying his anger 5 decades later. Historian John Hope Franklin described riding a segregated train where black soldiers were packed into one coach section, cramped and uncomfortable. The German POWs traveled in a more spacious compartment with their white guards. This was the funniest thing to the Germans, Franklin remembered in a 1995 interview. They were laughing and looking up there at us, standing on top of each other practically. Private Harold Hardy wrote to the NAACP in 1944, describing how it felt to watch German prisoners laugh at the sight of black American soldiers forced to march separately from white soldiers. I know what is in their Aryan minds, Hardy wrote. Ha ha, they're saying, the black Yank is only good as a workhorse. The psychological impact was devastating. These men had volunteered or been drafted to fight for their country. They'd left their families, their jobs, their lives. They were facing the possibility of death in combat, and their own country treated them worse than enemy soldiers. The Germans, who'd been trying to kill Americans just months earlier, got better treatment than the Americans who wore the same uniform. It wasn't just about lunch counters and train cars. It was about what that treatment communicated, that black Americans weren't really American, that their service didn't matter, that their lives were worth less than German prisoners of war, that no matter what they did, no matter how they served, they would never be equal. But something was shifting. The response to Trimmingham's letter proved it. Thousands of white American servicemen, many from the South, were saying openly that this was wrong, that it had to change, that the discrimination black soldiers faced wasn't just unfair to those soldiers, it was a betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for. The WW2 campaign that black newspapers had been promoting since 1942 was taking hold. Victory over fascism abroad. Victory over racism at home. The two couldn't be separated. You couldn't fight Hitler's racism while practicing your own. Philip Randolph, the labor leader who'd successfully pressured President Franklin Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 8802 banning discrimination in defense industries, was now pushing for military desegregation. In 1942, an estimated 18,000 black Americans gathered at Madison Square Garden to hear Randolph call for ending discrimination in the military, war industries, government agencies, and labor unions. The NAACP was documenting case after case of discrimination against black servicemen. Their executive secretary, Walter White, toured European, Mediterranean, and Pacific theaters during the war. Observing and reporting on the experiences of black soldiers, the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, and at the highest levels of government, some people were paying attention. President Harry Truman, who'd taken office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was being confronted with the reality of military racism. On February 12, 1946, a black soldier named Isaac Woodard was attacked by South Carolina police hours after receiving his honorable discharge. The attack left Woodard permanently blind. He was still in uniform when it happened. The brutality of the attack, the fact that it happened to a decorated veteran still wearing his uniform, shocked even people who'd previously ignored racial violence. A delegation of civil rights leaders met with President Truman on September 19, 1946, and told him Woodard's story. Truman was horrified. He ordered a federal investigation. The case, combined with dozens of other documented incidents of violence against black veterans, convinced Truman that something had to change. In 1947, Truman established the President's Committee on Civil Rights. Their report, To Secure These Rights, condemned the state of civil rights in America and recommended specific actions. In June 1947, Truman gave a historic speech to the NAACP, in which he described civil rights as a moral imperative. On July 26, 1948, 4 years and 3 months after Trimmingham's letter was published, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The order stated, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The United States military would be desegregated." It didn't happen overnight. Some branches of the military resisted. Army Chief of Staff General Omar Bradley initially opposed the order, saying the Army is not out to make any social reforms. Truman forced Bradley to issue a public apology. Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal refused to implement desegregation and was forced into retirement in April 1949, nearly a year after Truman's order. But the momentum was unstoppable. The Korean War, which began in 1950, accelerated integration when undermanned white units needed black soldiers to maintain combat effectiveness. The enlistment quota that had capped black enlistment at 10% was abolished in 1950. The Army agreed that all jobs would be opened based on qualifications, not race. On October 1, 1951, the 24th Infantry Regiment, the last of the segregated Buffalo Soldier regiments, was deactivated and its soldiers were reassigned to integrated units. In September 1954, the last all-black unit in the United States military was abolished. 15 years after Truman's order, in July 1963, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara issued a directive encouraging military commanders to use their authority against discriminatory facilities near military bases. The process was long, difficult, and imperfect. But it happened. The United States military, which had been systematically segregated since its founding, became integrated, not perfectly, not immediately, not without resistance and setbacks and continued discrimination, but fundamentally, permanently integrated. And one of the crucial early steps in that process was a letter written by a 44-year-old corporal from Trinidad who'd been forced to eat in a kitchen while German POWs sat at tables. Rupert Trimmingham never became famous. After the war, he returned to civilian life. He was honorably discharged in 1946 and moved to Gary, Indiana, where he worked as an electrician for the Singer Sewing Machine Company. In 1950, he became a naturalized United States citizen. The country that had treated him as less than equal, that had forced him to eat in kitchens while serving its enemies lunch, finally recognized him as a full citizen. In 1956, he moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. He lived there quietly until his death on May 9, 1985, at age 85. He was buried in Fairview Cemetery in Ann Arbor. His wife, Harriet, whom he'd married in Pima County, Arizona in 1943, died in 2005 and was buried beside him. In 2001, PBS's American Experience series featured actor Courtney B. Vance reading Trimmingham's letter as part of a presentation called War Letters. New generations heard the story of that railroad station, those German prisoners, that kitchen doorway. Historians studying the path to military desegregation now recognize Trimmingham's letter as a crucial moment, not because it changed everything by itself. One letter never does, but because it articulated clearly, powerfully, publicly, what thousands of black soldiers were experiencing and questioning, because it forced white Americans to confront the contradiction at the heart of the war effort, because it contributed to a building momentum that couldn't be stopped. The story of Rupert Trimmingham's letter matters because it demonstrates how individual acts of courage can contribute to massive social change. Trimmingham didn't lead a march, or give a famous speech, or file a groundbreaking lawsuit. He just told the truth about what he saw. He wrote it down, sent it to a magazine, and trusted that his fellow soldiers would care, and they did. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, white soldiers from the Deep South, writing to say they recognized the injustice. Black soldiers writing to say they'd experienced the same thing. Military leadership being forced to acknowledge that this was a problem that couldn't be ignored. 4 years after Trimmingham watched German POWs eat lunch while he stood in a kitchen, the President of the United States ordered the military desegregated. That order didn't come from nowhere. It came from accumulating evidence, building pressure, changing attitudes. It came from cases like Isaac Woodard's blinding. It came from A. Philip Randolph's organizing, and the NAACP's documentation, and the WW campaign's insistence that victory abroad required victory at home. But it also came from moments like Trimmingham's, from a black soldier deciding he wouldn't accept this anymore, from writing down what happened, from demanding an answer to the question that had become unavoidable. What are we fighting for? The answer, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, began to change. Not because America suddenly became enlightened, not because white Americans woke up one day and decided racism was wrong, but because black Americans refused to keep silent, because they served anyway, fought anyway, demanded equality anyway, because they wrote letters and filed complaints and organized movements and wouldn't accept the answer that they should wait, should be patient, should accept their place. Today, the United States military is often cited as one of the most successfully integrated institutions in American society. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because of Executive Order 9981 and the difficult, contested implementation that followed. It happened because of the Korean War's battlefield integration and the civil rights movement's continued pressure. It happened because of decades of work by black service members who refused to accept discrimination even after official segregation ended. But the foundation for all of that was laid by people like Rupert Trimmingham, people who saw injustice and documented it, people who asked the questions that needed asking, people who believed that their country, despite everything, could be better than it was. In April 1944, 9 black soldiers ate in a kitchen while German prisoners of war sat at tables. One of those soldiers wrote about it. A magazine published it. Thousands of people read it and said, "This isn't right. This has to change." And eventually, because of that moment and thousands of moments like it, it did. That's why Corporal Rupert Trimmingham's story matters. Not because he was famous or powerful or influential, but because when faced with an injustice so obvious it couldn't be denied, he refused to stay silent. He wrote it down. He sent it in. He bet that America could do better, and he was right.